Captain Jake Morrison had seen a lot of weird stuff in his 15 years running Frontier Station Beta 7. Pirates trying to pay docking fees with livestock, diplomatic envoys who communicated exclusively through interpretive dance. That one time a sentient gas cloud tried to marry his coffee machine. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what was currently happening in his docking bay. The ship that had just clamped onto his station was the size of a small moon and looked like someone had crossed a battlecruiser with a particularly angry porcupine. Every surface bristled with weapons that could probably vaporize a planet before lunch. The thing's energy signature was so intense it made his radiation detectors weep softly in the corner. "So," Jake said, staring at the readouts while nursing his third cup of coffee that morning, "either we're about to be obliterated by the galaxy's most advanced war machine, or someone really important wants to have a chat." The airlock cycled with a hiss that sounded ominously like a death rattle. What stepped through made Jake seriously consider updating his will. Velkara was 8 feet of pure apex predator wrapped in what looked like organic armor that probably cost more than his entire station. She had 6 arms, each ending in claws that could probably carve through starship hulls, and a face that suggested she considered diplomacy a type of appetizer. Her species, the Keth Var, were legendary hunters who treated entire solar systems as their personal game preserves. She looked around Jake's modest docking bay with the expression of someone who'd just walked into a gas station bathroom. "Human," she said, her voice like gravel being processed through a wood chipper. "I require a service." Jake set down his coffee very carefully. "Well, that depends on the service. If it involves me becoming lunch, I'm afraid I'll have to decline." Velkara made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been her digesting something still alive. Then she turned toward her ship and made a series of clicks that sounded like a Geiger counter having a seizure. 3 small, furry shapes came tumbling out of the airlock. Jake blinked, then blinked again. "Are those?" "Cubs," Velkara confirmed, as if discussing the weather. "Mine." The 3 little creatures looked like someone had crossed a teddy bear with a baby tiger, and then given the result access to military-grade cuteness. They were about the size of house cats, covered in soft iridescent fur that shifted colors in the station's lighting. One was silver with gold streaks, another was deep blue with silver spots, and the third was an impossible shade of purple that probably didn't exist in any normal spectrum. They were also, Jake noticed with growing horror, looking around his station with the kind of intense curiosity usually reserved for demolitions experts. "Okay," Jake said slowly. "They're adorable. Congratulations on the successful reproduction. But why are they here instead of, with you?" Velkara fixed him with a stare that could have frozen hydrogen. "I am departing on an extended hunting expedition. The cubs require supervision. And you thought a human space station would be the ideal nursery because..." "Your species," Velkara said, hefting what looked suspiciously like a diaper bag, "has an inexplicable tendency to nurture anything smaller than yourselves. It is both pathetic and useful." One of the cubs, the silver one, had discovered Jake's coffee mug and was now attempting to climb inside it. The blue one was systematically testing the structural integrity of a nearby cargo container by headbutting it. The purple one was just sitting there, staring at Jake with unnervingly intelligent eyes. "How long are we talking here?" Jake asked, watching the blue cub leave small dents in reinforced steel. Velkara shrugged with 4 of her arms. "Time is relative. I will return when the hunt is complete." "Could you be a little more specific? Days? Weeks? Months?" "Perhaps." She turned to leave and Jake felt panic rising in his chest. "Wait, what do they eat? What about medical care? Do they have any allergies? Special needs? Behavioral issues?" Velkara paused at the airlock. "They are Kethvar cubs. They will adapt or die. Your choice." And with that cheerful piece of parenting advice she was gone. The massive ship detached from the station with all the ceremony of someone dropping off dry cleaning, leaving Jake alone with 3 alien predator cubs and a growing sense that his insurance premiums were about to skyrocket. The silver cub had successfully climbed into his coffee mug and was now making pleased, chirping sounds. The blue cub had given up on the cargo container and was now testing the tensile strength of Jake's uniform. The purple cub continued its unblinking stare. Jake looked at the 3 tiny creatures who were now, apparently, his responsibility. "Well," he said to the universe at large, "this is either going to be the best day of my life, or the beginning of a very expensive funeral." The purple cub tilted its head and made a sound that was unmistakably amused. Within an hour, Jake had assembled his senior staff for what he was already mentally referring to as the emergency that's going to define the rest of my career. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived first, her tablet already loaded with what appeared to be every xenobiological database in known space. She was the kind of scientist who could tell you the metabolic rate of a Rigelian slugworm from 3 sectors away, but right now she looked like someone had just asked her to perform brain surgery with a butter knife. "So," she said, staring at the Cubs, who were now exploring the conference room with methodical thoroughness, "when you said we had a situation, I was expecting maybe a diplomatic incident or a reactor leak, not this." Chief Engineer Tommy Wrench Mackenzie shambled in next, already carrying a toolbox because he approached every problem like it could be fixed with the right combination of duct tape and creative profanity. He took one look at the Cubs and started muttering calculations under his breath. "The silver one just walked through my chair," he announced, "clean through it, like it wasn't even there." Elena's head snapped up. "What do you mean, walked through it?" "I mean walked through it. Phase shifted or some such nonsense. One second it's sniffing the leg, next second it's on the other side and my chair's still in one piece." Security Chief Zara al-Rashid entered at that exact moment, just in time to see the blue cub open its mouth and drool a small puddle of what was definitely not normal saliva onto the conference table. The puddle immediately began smoking and eating through the surface. "Nope," Zara said, already backing toward the door. "Absolutely not. I signed up to handle drunk miners and smugglers, not whatever fresh hell this is." "Sit down, Zara," Jake said wearily. "We're all in this together." "The hell we are. I've seen enough alien movies to know how this ends." The purple cub, who Jake was beginning to suspect was the leader of the 3, picked up a metal stylus from the table. It weighed maybe 2 ounces. The cub held it for a moment, then casually bent it into a pretzel shape. "Okay," Elena said, her scientific mind apparently overriding her survival instincts. "That's impossible. That much force should require—" She trailed off, doing rapid calculations. Oh no!" "What? Oh no?" Jake asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know. "If my calculations are correct, and they usually are, that little guy just demonstrated the ability to exert approximately 2,000 pounds of pressure per square inch, with his fingers." Wrench whistled low. "Well, that explains why my cargo container looks like someone took a hammer to it." "This is insane," Zara muttered, but Jake noticed she'd stopped backing toward the door and was now watching the Cubs with professional interest. "What else can they do?" As if summoned by her question, the silver cub suddenly vanished entirely, reappeared behind Wrench's chair, climbed up his back, and perched on his shoulder like the world's most dangerous parrot. "Okay, that's actually kind of adorable," Zara admitted. "Adorable things that can phase through matter and bench press a shuttle," Elena said grimly. "This is how horror movies start." Jake watched the blue cub, who had apparently gotten bored with destroying furniture and was now attempting to eat one of Elena's research tablets. "The question is, what do we do with them? We can't exactly put them in the station daycare." "What daycare?" Wrench asked. "We don't have a daycare." "Exactly my point." Elena was frantically swiping through her databases. "I'm not finding much on Kethvar developmental biology. Most researchers who get close enough to study them end up as research subjects themselves." "Comforting," Jake said. "What about basic care? Food, sleep, that sort of thing?" "The blue one just ate my tablet," Elena reported. "The whole thing, metal, circuits, everything. And he looks satisfied?" "So they eat electronics," Zara said. "Great. What do we feed them when they've consumed the entire station?" The purple cub made a soft trilling sound and toddled over to Jake. It looked up at him with those unsettling, intelligent eyes and very deliberately placed one tiny paw on his boot. Then it sat down and continued staring. "I think," Jake said slowly, "it's claiming me." "Like imprinting?" Elena asked. "That's actually fascinating from a behavioral standpoint." "Less fascinating when the thing doing the imprinting can probably tear my arm off," Jake pointed out. Wrench, who still had the silver cub perched on his shoulder, was scratching it behind what might have been ears. "You know, it's kind of like having a cat. If cats could walk through walls and had the grip strength of a hydraulic press." Over the next few hours they established some ground rules through trial and error, mostly error. The cubs seemed to understand basic commands, though they had their own interpretation of concepts like stay and don't eat that. Elena discovered they were incredibly fast learners, picking up patterns and cause and effect relationships after just a few repetitions. Wrench found that they treated his increasingly elaborate containment systems as entertainment, solving each puzzle lock and reinforced barrier like it was a particularly engaging toy. Zara learned that they responded to firm authority, as long as that authority came with genuine affection. And Jake realized, somewhere between the silver cub learning to fetch his coffee mug and the purple one figuring out how to operate the door controls, that they were all in serious trouble. Not because the cubs were dangerous, though they absolutely were. Not because they were destroying the station, though the repair bills were going to be astronomical. No, they were in trouble because, despite everything, the cubs were growing on them. The way they chirped when happy, how they instinctively protected each other, the obvious intelligence behind their actions. Even their destructive tendencies seemed more like enthusiastic exploration than malice. "We're doomed," he announced to his assembled staff. "What do you mean?" Elena asked, currently bottle-feeding the blue cub what appeared to be liquefied circuitry. "Because we're getting attached," Jake said. "And when Velkara comes back, we're going to have to give them up." The purple cub, who had taken up a permanent residence at Jake's feet, made a soft sound that was remarkably similar to a human laugh. "Maybe," Wrench said, as the silver cub helped him sort bolts by size with surprising accuracy. "She won't come back," was a thought that should have been comforting. Instead, it terrified Jake more than anything else that had happened that day. 6 months later, Jake had developed what he liked to call his 1,000-yard dad stare. It was the expression of a man who had been woken up at 3 in the morning by the sound of his adopted alien children attempting to dismantle the environmental systems to see how they work. The cubs had grown. Not just physically, though they were now the size of medium dogs with correspondingly increased destructive potential. They had grown intellectually, emotionally, and in ways that kept Elena frantically updating her research notes. Captain's log, day 187 of Operation Accidental Parenting. Jake muttered into his recorder while watching Fluffy, as they'd inevitably nickname the silver cub, face through a reinforced bulkhead to retrieve a bowl. The subjects continued to display impossible abilities while somehow managing to be the most well-behaved monsters in the galaxy. It was true. Despite their capabilities, the cubs had developed what could only be described as manners. They waited for permission before phasing through walls. Chaos had learned to ask before dissolving things with his increasingly potent saliva. And Destroyer, who Jake suspected could probably bench press a shuttle by now, was gentle enough to play catch with the station's maintenance crew without accidentally launching anyone into orbit. "Jake," Elena's voice crackled over the comm, "you need to see this." He found her in the observation deck with all 3 cubs arranged in what looked suspiciously like a classroom setting. Elena was holding up flashcards with basic mathematical symbols, and the cubs were responding by holding up the correct number of claws. "They're doing calculus," Elena announced without preamble. "Come again?" "Calculus? I started with basic addition last week as an enrichment exercise. They mastered that in 2 days, so I moved to multiplication. They figured that out before lunch. Now they're solving differential equations." Jake watched Destroyer carefully manipulate his claws to show the solution to what looked like a physics problem. "That's not normal, right?" "Jake, human children don't usually master calculus until they're teenagers, if ever. These cubs are 6 months old and they're already showing problem-solving skills that rival our best engineers." As if to prove her point, Chaos wandered over to a broken console that Wrench had been struggling with all morning. The cubs studied it for a moment, then carefully applied a small drop of his saliva to precisely the right spot. The corroded connection dissolved cleanly, and the console hummed back to life. "Show off," Wrench called from across the room, but he was grinning. The cubs had also developed distinct personalities that went far beyond their abilities. Fluffy was the curious one, constantly exploring and testing boundaries, but always within the limits they'd established. He'd learned to knock before phasing through doors, and had developed an endearing habit of bringing Jake his morning coffee by materializing it directly from the replicator to his desk. Chaos was the engineer of the group, fascinated by how things worked and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to identify the exact component that needed fixing. His acidic saliva had proven invaluable for precision repairs, though Jake still had nightmares about the station's insurance premiums. Destroyer was the protector, always positioning himself between his brothers and any perceived threat. He'd also become Jake's shadow, following him on his rounds and somehow managing to make his massive strength look graceful. The first time a drunk miner had gotten aggressive in the station bar, Destroyer had simply placed one paw on the man's shoulder. The miner had sobered up instantly and apologized for his behavior. "The really interesting development," Elena continued, "is their communication skills." "You mean the way they've started responding to basic commands?" "No, Jake. I mean the way they've started giving basic commands." She activated a recording on her tablet. The cubs could be heard making their usual chittering and trilling sounds, but now there was structure to it, patterns and repetitions that suggested actual language. Yesterday I watched Fluffy tell Chaos where to find a specific tool that Wrench had misplaced, not through gestures or demonstration, but through what can only be described as verbal instruction. Jake felt a familiar chill of concern. How advanced are we talking? I ran the recordings through the linguistic analysis protocols. Jake, they're not just communicating, they're developing syntax, grammar, and abstract concepts. At this rate, they'll be speaking standard within a month. The implications hit Jake like a cargo hauler. Elena, what exactly are we raising here? Before she could answer, Destroyer wandered over and very deliberately placed his paw on Jake's knee. The cub looked up at him with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes and said, in perfectly clear standard, "Hungry." The observation deck went dead silent. Well, Wrench said eventually, that answers that question. Over the following weeks, the cub's language development exploded. They went from single words to simple sentences to complex conversations with a speed that left the crew reeling. But more concerning was what they chose to talk about. "Jake's sad today," Fluffy observed one morning, materializing next to Jake's desk with his usual offering of coffee. "I'm not sad, buddy, just tired." "Worried," Chaos corrected, looking up from the console he was repairing. "About Mother." The casual way he said "Mother" made Jake's blood run cold, because Chaos wasn't talking about Velkara. "Jake is our pack leader," Destroyer added with the certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "Pack leaders worry about their pack." "We're not a pack," Jake protested weakly. All three cubs fixed him with identical expressions of patient amusement. "Alina teaches," Fluffy said. "Wrench builds, Zara protects, Jake leads. Pack." "Pack," Chaos and Destroyer agreed in unison. That night, Jake found himself on the observation deck, staring out at the stars and wondering what the hell he was supposed to do. The cubs had claimed him, claimed all of them, with the casual certainty of children who had never known anything else. And the terrifying thing was, he had started thinking of them the same way. The long-range sensors chose that moment to start screaming. "Jake," Zara's voice came over the comm, tense with professional alertness. "We've got 3 ships incoming, big ones, and they're not broadcasting friendly intentions." Jake looked down at Destroyer, who had somehow appeared at his side without him noticing. "Mother?" the cub asked, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Nobody," Jake said, his hand automatically moving to rest on the cub's head. "I don't think it's your mother." The Destroyer's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked dangerous. "Then who comes for our pack?" The 3 ships that dropped out of hyperspace weren't just big, they were the kind of big that made Jake's station look like a child's toy floating next to a skyscraper. Each one bristled with enough firepower to sterilize a small moon, and their sleek, predatory design screamed Kethvar military, with the subtlety of a supernova. "Well," Jake muttered, watching the tactical display, "I guess we're about to find out what happens when the galaxy's apex predators come looking for their missing heirs." The lead ship hailed them with all the ceremony of a tax collector. The face that appeared on Jake's main screen belonged to someone who looked like Velkara's bigger, angrier brother. He had the same 6 arms, the same organic armor, and the same general expression that suggested he considered negotiations a form of foreplay before the real violence began. "Human station," the alien said in accented standard. "I am War Commander Thek Mor of the Kethvar Dominion. You will immediately surrender the cubs of the late Velkara to our custody." Jake felt his stomach drop into his boots. Late? Velkara fell in battle 3 rotations ago. The cubs are now property of the Dominion and will be collected for proper training. "Property?" Elena's voice came from behind Jake, sharp enough to cut steel. "Did this walking nightmare just call children property?" Thekmore's predatory gaze shifted to Elena. "You are the station's science officer. You will prepare the cubs for transport. They have been contaminated by prolonged exposure to inferior species and will require extensive reconditioning." That was when Destroyer spoke up from his position at Jake's feet. In perfectly clear, unmistakably polite standard, he said, "Excuse me, War Commander, Thekmore, but I believe there has been a misunderstanding." The silence that followed could have been measured in geological epochs. Thekmore stared at the purple cub with the expression of someone who had just watched his breakfast start doing calculus. "The cubs speak," Thekmore said slowly, as if testing whether the words made sense when spoken aloud. "Among other things," Fluffy added helpfully, phasing through Jake's chair to perch on the arm. We also read, write, solve differential equations, and Jake taught us poker, though we are not allowed to play with the minors anymore after the incident. What incident? Chaos asked, looking up from the console he had been absently optimizing. The one where you accidentally dissolved their cards when you got excited about a full house, Jake reminded him. That was an accident, Caleth protested. I said I was sorry. Tekmor's second in command, who looked like he had been carved from particularly violent stone, leaned into frame. War Commander, this is unprecedented. Kethvar cubs do not develop linguistic capabilities until their third-year cycle. I am aware of normal development patterns, Thekmor snapped. Then, to Jake, what have you done to them? Done to them? Jake's temper, which had been simmering since the word property, finally boiled over. We've fed them, educated them, kept them safe, and given them a family. You know, basic parenting stuff. Maybe you've heard of it. You dare imply that humans are superior caretakers to the Kethvar? I'm not implying anything. I'm stating it outright. When's the last time you read them a bedtime story? Taught them to play catch? Helped them with their homework? Homework, Thekbor repeated, as if Jake had just claimed the cubs were practicing interpretive dance. Alina's been teaching us xenobiology, Destroyer explained patiently. Yesterday we learned about 17 different respiratory systems across known species. It was fascinating. And Wrench showed us how to calibrate quantum resonance frequencies, Fluffy added, though we are not allowed to do it unsupervised after we accidentally created a minor temporal distortion. That was also an accident, Chaos said defensively. Elena stepped forward, her tablet loaded with months of research data. War Commander, these cubs have developed cognitive abilities that are literally unprecedented. Their problem-solving skills, linguistic development, and emotional intelligence are off the charts. They're not just intelligent, they're brilliant. Because of contamination from inferior species? Thukmar insisted, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. No, Jake said firmly, because someone actually bothered to nurture that intelligence, instead of just training them to hunt and kill. Destroyer stood up, all 4 feet of purple, adorable death machine, and looked directly at Thekmor. War Commander, with respect, we have chosen our pack. We will not be leaving. You do not have a choice. You are cubs. We are cubs who have been taught that family is not about biology, Fluffy said, materializing next to Jake's shoulder. It is about love, protection, and choosing to stay together even when it is difficult. Particularly when it is difficult, Chaos added, having apparently decided that the console was optimized enough in moving to flank Jake's other side. Tekmor's expression was cycling through confusion, outrage, and what might have been the first stirrings of genuine concern. This is unacceptable. The cubs will be returned to proper Kethvar custody for appropriate conditioning. Over my dead Mahdi, Jake said flatly. This can be arranged. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as all 3 cubs suddenly went very, very still. Jake had seen them playful, curious, and affectionate. He had never seen them angry. He was beginning to understand why the Kethvar were considered apex predators. War Commander, Destroyer said, his voice still perfectly polite but now carrying an undertone that made Jake's survival instincts scream warnings. You have just threatened our pack leader. This is unwise. Tekmor laughed, a sound like grinding metal. Cubs do not threaten war commanders. We are not making threats, Fluffy said, his form becoming slightly translucent. We are explaining consequences. On the tactical display, alarms started going off aboard all 3 Kethvar ships simultaneously. War Commander, came a panicked voice from Thekmor's bridge. Our weapon systems are malfunctioning. Something is interfering with the targeting matrices. And our hull plating appears to be dissolving in several locations, added another voice. Sir, we're reading massive structural stress on the primary support beams. It's like something is applying precise pressure to specific failure points. Thekmor's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. Impossible. The cubs are here, on your station. Jake looked down at his 3 adopted children, who were still standing calmly at his sides. Guys, how exactly are you doing that? Quantum entanglement applications, Destroyer explained matter-of-factly. Elena taught us about quantum mechanics last month. We adapted the principles. You can affect matter at a distance through quantum entanglement? Elena squeaked. Only when we are very motivated, Chaos said. Such as when someone threatens our family. The comm system crackled with increasingly frantic reports from the Kethvar fleet. Systems failing, hull breaches appearing, structural integrity compromised, but all of it surgical, precise, designed to disable rather than destroy. This is your final warning, War Commander, Destroyer said, his young voice carrying absolute authority. We have chosen our pack. We will defend our pack, and we have learned much about defending things we love from our human family. Jake felt a surge of pride so intense it was almost painful. That's my boys, he said softly. Tech Moore stared at the cubs, then at Jake, then at the reports streaming in from his increasingly crippled fleet. This is not over, he said finally. Actually, Jake said, settling back in his chair with his 3 kids arranged protectively around him, I think it is. Unless you want to explain to the Dominion how 3 cubs who've been contaminated by humans just systematically dismantled your entire task force. The transmission cut out, and within an hour the 3 ships had limped away into hyperspace. Well, Wrench said, breaking the stunned silence, that was terrifying and adorable at the same time. I am updating my research notes, Elena announced. Again. Jake looked down at Destroyer, who was now back to his usual calm demeanor. Quantum entanglement? We may have learned more than just poker from you humans, Destroyer said with what Jake was learning to recognize as the cub equivalent of a mischievous grin. We learned that family is worth fighting for, Fluffy added. And that sometimes, Chaos concluded, the best way to solve a problem is to dissolve it, carefully. Jake gathered all 3 cubs into what had become their traditional group hug. I'm proud of you guys, and terrified, but mostly proud. Good, Destroyer said, settling against Jake's side. Pack leaders should be proud of their pack's abilities to protect the family. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance, and Jake realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped worrying about when Valkara might return. His family was complete exactly as it was. Jake should have known that Thekmore wasn't the type to give up easily. He should have anticipated that a war commander who had just been humiliated by 3 cubs would come back with backup. He definitely should have expected that the Kethvar concept of backup would involve enough firepower to crack a planet in half. What he hadn't expected was for the backup to arrive at Odug 30, while he was attempting to untangle Fluffy from the station's ventilation system. Jake! Zara's voice crackled over the comm with the kind of controlled panic that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. We've got a problem. Define problem, Jake said, finally extracting a sheepish Fluffy from a maintenance shaft. Because if it's just Chaos trying to improve the replicators again, I'm declaring that a Tuesday. Try 12 Kethvar dreadnoughts dropping out of hyperspace with active targeting locks. Jake felt his blood turn to ice water. 12? 12. And Jake? They're not here to negotiate. The comm system squealed to life with the sound of incoming transmission. This time, the face that appeared on the screen wasn't Thekmore. This was someone who made Thekmore look like a particularly cuddly teddy bear. The newcomer had 8 arms instead of 6, scars that told stories of 1,000 battles, and eyes that suggested he had personally ended several small wars before lunch. Nope, this might be the most powerful ship of Human Station, the nightmare spoke in a voice like grinding starship hulls. I am Prime War Leader Zekthar of the Kethvar Supreme Command. You harbor stolen property of the Dominion. You will surrender immediately or be destroyed. Stolen property? Jake's temper flared despite the very real threat of imminent vaporization. They're children, not cargo. Bjorn Kethvar cubs who have been corrupted beyond acceptable parameters. War Commander Thekmore's report indicates they have developed abilities that pose a threat to Dominion security. This cannot be tolerated. Elena's voice came from behind Jake, tight with scientific fascination and parental fury. So, you're here to collect them or kill them? Collection is no longer the primary objective. Elimination of the security threat is. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. They weren't here to take the cubs away. They were here to murder his children because they had learned too much, become too powerful, too independent. Over my dead Mahdi, Jake said, and meant every word. As you wish. That was when Destroyer stepped into view, positioning himself between Jake and the screen with the casual confidence of someone who had just made a decision that would reshape the local galaxy. Prime War Leader Zekthar, Destroyer said in that same perfectly polite tone that had preceded the last fleet's dismantlement. You have just declared your intention to harm our pack. This is unacceptable. Zekthar's scarred face twisted into what might have been amusement. A cub threatens the Supreme Command? We do not threaten, Fluffy said, materializing next to his brother with a shimmer that suggested reality was becoming negotiable in his immediate vicinity. We explain consequences. And we have learned much about consequences from our human family, Chaos added, his saliva already beginning to smoke as his emotional state elevated his biochemistry to combat levels. Jake looked at his 3 adopted sons and realized they weren't cubs anymore. Maybe they never had been. They were something new, something that had never existed before in the galaxy. They were HFY apex predators, raised with human concepts of family, loyalty, and creative problem-solving. The galaxy was about to learn why that combination was terrifying. "Boys," Jake said quietly, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Whatever happens next, I'm proud to be your pack leader." Destroyer looked up at him with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. "Jake taught us that family protects family, always. Even when it's hard," Fluffy added. "Especially when it's hard," Chaos concluded. And then, with the synchronization of a perfectly choreographed dance, all 3 cubs did something that made Jake's understanding of physics curl up in a corner and sob quietly. They linked. Not physically, they were still standing separately around Jake's feet, but something connected them, some quantum entanglement or psychic resonance or just pure force of will that made the air around them hum with barely contained energy. "Scanning 12 vessels," Destroyer announced, his voice now carrying harmonics from his brothers. "Identifying critical systems." "Hull integrity points located," Fluffy reported, his form flickering between solid and translucent. "Structural weaknesses mapped." "Weapons systems analyzed," Chaos added, his acidic saliva now actively steaming. "Countermeasures prepared." On the tactical display, 12 massive dreadnoughts hung in space like mechanical gods of war. Each one possessed enough firepower to reduce Jake's station to constituent atoms. Each one was crewed by hundreds of the galaxy's most effective predators. None of that mattered. The cubs had learned strategy from Jake's old military texts. They had learned precision from Elena's scientific methods. They had learned creative engineering from Wrench's improvisational repairs. They had learned protective instincts from Zara's security protocols. And they had learned that when someone threatens your family, you don't hold back. "Initiating defensive protocols," the 3 cubs said in unison, their voices layering into harmonics that made the station's hull ring like a struck bell. What happened next would be talked about in xeno-military academies for centuries. 12 dreadnoughts, each one a pinnacle of Kethvar engineering, each one crewed by elite warriors who had conquered entire star systems, began to systematically fall apart. Not exploding, not burning, falling apart. Hull plates separated along stress lines with surgical precision. Weapon systems seized as their focusing crystals developed microscopic fractures in exactly the right places to cause cascading failures. Shield generators overloaded as their power coupling developed tiny holes that let containment leak away. "Impossible," Zekthar snarled, his transmission crackling with interference as his flagship's communications array began to develop connectivity issues. "How are they doing this?" "Quantum entanglement manipulation," Elena breathed, watching her instruments record impossible readings. "But on a scale I've never seen. They're not just affecting individual particles, they're coordinating complex molecular restructuring across multiple targets simultaneously. At a distance of several thousand kilometers," Wrench added, his voice full of professional admiration and existential terror, while maintaining pinpoint accuracy on systems they've never directly examined. "They're not just smart," Zara realized. "They're strategic geniuses." Jake watched his children systematically dismantle a fleet that could have sterilized entire worlds, and felt a pride so intense it was almost painful. "They learned that from us," he said softly. The cubs weren't just taking apart the ships. They were doing it in a way that demonstrated complete understanding of Kethvar military doctrine, crew psychology, and tactical thinking. They were disabling weapons first, then shields, then engines, leaving the crews alive but completely helpless. It was surgical, precise, and absolutely devastating. "How?" Zekthar demanded, his transmission now barely intelligible through the static of failing systems. The destroyer looked directly into the pickup, his young face serene despite the unprecedented display of power he and his brothers were coordinating. "You taught us that strength determines survival. Humans taught us that intelligence determines how to apply that strength. We have chosen to be strong enough to protect our family, and intelligent enough to do it properly. This is not possible for cubs," Zekthar insisted, even as his flagship listed to one side as its maneuvering thrusters developed sudden and selective malfunctions. "We are not cubs," Fluffy said, his form now flickering rapidly between states of matter. "We are something new." We are Kethvar who learned human concepts, Chaos added, his biochemistry now operating at levels that should have been impossible for his size. We are pack members who will protect our pack. And we are done being underestimated, all three said in unison. The last functional weapon system on the lead dreadnought seized up with a sound like a dying mechanical whale. 12 of the most advanced warships in known space hung in space like broken toys, their crews alive but completely at the mercy of 3 children who had just redefined what was possible. This is your final warning, Prime War Leader, Jake said, his arm around Destroyer while Fluffy perched on his shoulder and Chaos leaned against his leg. These are my sons. They have chosen their family, and anyone who threatens them will learn exactly how creative a human-raised Kethvar can be when properly motivated. Zektar stared at them through the static of his failing transmission. This is not over. Actually, Jake said with the satisfaction of someone who had just won an impossible victory, I think it is. You came here with 12 dreadnoughts to eliminate 3 children. Those children just proved they could have eliminated your 12 dreadnoughts any time they wanted to. The only reason you're still breathing is because humans taught them that mercy is a sign of strength, not weakness. The transmission cut out. Over the next hour, 12 crippled warships limped away into hyperspace, carrying word back to the Kethvar Dominion that the cubs of Valkara were no longer missing children. They were something the galaxy had never seen before. Apex predators raised with human values, combining Kethvar abilities with human creativity, loyalty, and stubborn protective instincts. So, Wrench said eventually, breaking the awed silence, anyone else feeling like we just accidentally created the next stage of galactic evolution? Jake looked down at his 3 sons, who were now back to their normal, adorable selves, asking Elena if she could help them with their quantum mechanics homework. Yeah, he said softly, and I couldn't be prouder. 1 year later, Jake stood on the observation deck of what was now officially designated as Frontier Station Beta 7, Interspecies Cultural Exchange Hub, and tried to process how his life had become completely, wonderfully insane. The station had tripled in size, not through construction, but through what Wrench cheerfully called creative space management. Fluffy had learned to phase-extend sections of the station into pocket dimensions, effectively giving them unlimited room without violating any pesky laws of physics. The Galactic Engineering Corps was still trying to figure out how that worked, and Jake had stopped trying to explain it. Captain's log, day 365 of operation, we accidentally became the galaxy's weirdest success story, Jake muttered into his recorder while watching a delegation of Regalian diplomats attempt to teach their younglings how to play zero-gravity hopscotch with Destroyer. The subjects continue to exceed all expectations while somehow managing to make the impossible look routine. The cubs weren't cubs anymore. At a year and a half, they were the size of large dogs with the intellectual capacity of graduate students and the emotional maturity of someone who had learned that protecting your family was the most important job in the universe. They had also, much to Jake's continued amazement, become ambassadors. It had started when a trade dispute between 2 minor species had escalated to the point where both sides were threatening to call in the Galactic Mediation Council. The cubs had listened to both arguments, spent about 10 minutes in their quantum link thinking mode, and then presented a solution that not only resolved the immediate conflict, but established a framework for future cooperation that both species adopted as standard practice. Word had spread. Apparently 3 apex predators raised by humans and trained in creative problem-solving were exactly what the galaxy needed to solve problems that traditional diplomacy couldn't touch. Jake, Elena's voice crackled over the comm. The Centauran delegation is here for the Adoption Protocols meeting. Jake sighed and headed for Conference Room 3, which had been redesigned to accommodate species with wildly different atmospheric requirements. Another fluffy innovation involving selective phase shifting of environmental barriers. The Centaurans were an insectoid species whose young apparently bonded with the first non-parental adult they encountered. Their traditional solution involved ritual combat to determine the worthiest guardian. The cubs had suggested a much simpler approach. Let the younglings choose. Captain Morrison, the lead Centauran, clicked in accented standard. We have reviewed your protocols. This concept of choice-based bonding is revolutionary. Credit goes to my boys, Jake said, settling into his chair just as Destroyer materialized next to him. Literally, the cub had learned to use short-range quantum tunneling for dramatic entrances. They pointed out that maybe asking the kids what they wanted might be more effective than having adults fight over them. Revolutionary, the Centauran repeated. We wish to implement these protocols throughout our species' colonial territories. Chaos wandered in, carrying what appeared to be a perfectly balanced chemical solution that would allow the Centauran younglings to survive in the station's standard atmosphere. He had developed it that morning as a quick project before breakfast. "The mixture is stable for 72 hours, Chaos reported, setting down the container. "I included flavor enhancers based on Centauran dietary preferences. The younglings should find it pleasant." The lead Centauran stared at the cub who had just casually solved a biochemical problem that their best scientists had been working on for decades. "How old is he?" 18 months, standard, Jake said. "But he learned xenobiology from our science officer and has been experimenting with atmospheric chemistry as a hobby." "A hobby. Last week he accidentally created a universal translator bacterium," Elena added, entering the room with her ever-present tablet full of research notes. "We're still trying to figure out if that's medically safe or a potential biological weapon." Fluffy phased through the wall, carrying a datapad with what appeared to be a comprehensive cultural analysis of 17 different species' child-rearing practices. "I have completed the comparative study you requested. The optimal approach appears to be a hybrid model, incorporating choice-based selection with structured mentorship protocols." "He wrote that this morning," Jake explained to the increasingly amazed Centaurans. "In his spare time, between helping Wrench recalibrate the quantum resonance chambers and teaching a group of Andromedan youngsters how to play three-dimensional chess." The meeting proceeded with the kind of efficient problem-solving that had become standard since the Cubs had started participating in diplomatic functions. They didn't just translate between species, they created entirely new frameworks for cooperation, based on understanding each culture's fundamental values and finding creative ways to bridge differences. 2 hours later, the Centaurans left with a signed agreement that would revolutionize childcare across their entire civilization. Jake found himself alone with his 3 sons in the conference room, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a family that had learned to work together. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "another successful day of accidentally reshaping galactic civilization?" "We prefer to think of it as applied problem-solving," Destroyer said with dignity. "With a focus on practical applications of theoretical frameworks," Fluffy added. "And optimal resource allocation for maximum cultural benefit," Chaos concluded. Jake looked at his 3 boys, who could casually dismantle fleets, solve centuries-old diplomatic crises, and create new scientific breakthroughs before lunch, but who still insisted on group hugs every morning and bedtime stories every night. "You know," he said slowly, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad Velkara dropped you off here." "We are glad too," Destroyer said, settling against Jake's side with the easy affection of someone who had never doubted where he belonged. "Though we sometimes wonder what would have happened if she had returned," Fluffy mused, materializing into Jake's lap despite being far too large for such behavior. "She would have been very confused," Chaos said practically, draping himself across Jake's feet. "We are not the Cubs she left behind." "No," Jake agreed, gathering his sons into their traditional pile of impossible physics and unconditional love. "You're something much better. You're exactly who you chose to become." Through the observation windows, Jake could see the steady stream of ships arriving and departing from the station. Trade vessels, diplomatic couriers, research expeditions, and the occasional family group bringing their younglings to learn from the Kethvar pack bonded to humans, who had become the galaxy's most effective cultural mediators. "Jake," Elena's voice came over the comm, "we've got another situation developing. Apparently 3 different species have dropped off their younglings in Docking Bay 7 with notes asking if we could work our magic on interspecies cooperation." Jake looked down at his 3 sons, who were already exchanging the kind of looks that meant they were planning something that would probably be brilliant, definitely be impossible, and absolutely be successful. "Well, boys," he said, "looks like we're about to get even bigger." "Good," Destroyer said with satisfaction. "Pack should be big enough to protect everyone who needs protecting." "And smart enough to solve any problem," Fluffy added. "And creative enough to make it fun," Chaos concluded. Jake Morrison, former military captain turned accidental interspecies pack leader, looked around at his impossible family and his unlikely success story, and realized he wouldn't change a thing. Except maybe he'd invest in better insurance. The way things were going, he had a feeling they were going to need it.